Welcome to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist, a podcast dedicated to empowering you to take control of your life, learning valuable strategies for healing and looking at mental health through a trauma-informed lens. Get ready to feel empowered and confident in managing your symptoms. And now, here is your host, licensed clinical social worker, EMDR therapist, and certified clinical trauma professional, Jamie Vollmoeller.
Welcome to Good Enough. I am your host, Jamie Vollmoeller from Long Island EMDR. And today I have with us our wonderful clinician, Chelsea Mojalali. I said that right, correct, Chelsea?
You did, which is really impressive.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And so today we were going to talk to Chelsea because we've been talking a lot about trauma and dissociation and why it's so important for us to understand our past and learn our full selves. And Chelsea is trained in internal family systems. So I'm going to let her go ahead and explain to you guys in layman's terms what that means.
Yeah. So internal family systems is a little different than maybe how traditional therapy is working, just in the way we're looking at an individual, which is less about, well, it's like we're all multiple. So instead of us all being one single thing, IFS looks at everyone as if they have basically multiple personalities without that being
a diagnosis.
Yeah, exactly. So like, for example, with me, I might have, a part of me that gets angry, a part of me that gets really sad, we all have that, and we all kind of talk in this way without realizing.
Mm-hmm.
So this model just works to look at those different aspects or parts of ourselves, and to really get to know them and to learn more about why they do the things they do, especially when maybe we have a part that takes over and we don't necessarily like how that then makes us function or like is creating a behavior that's challenging.
Yeah. And that's something that our listeners we've talked about before. I say a lot that I have, so you could share this, Chelsea, you're not sharing your client stuff, but I've said before, like I have a teenage part of me that tends to be more, aggressive and hostile. And like she's the no F's given Jamie. And then there's, there's 10-year-old me who's like super people pleaser and just wants everyone to be happy and super selfless. And, so we all have these different parts of ourselves that emerge from different parts of our life where these behaviors were survival mechanisms that were needed.
Yeah.
And then what happens in adulthood is that we kind of default back to them when things trigger us back to that feeling state.
Yeah.
But we're not always conscious of it. And the way that we responded in the past is not necessarily the way that we need to respond now, but it does cause that, could you speak to the disconnect that it causes or that internal conflict it causes with some of your clients when you have two conflicting directions?
Polarized parts that come up around I think, let's think of an example. If you're just trying to make a decision, maybe it's about going out to be social. You want to be more social. You have a part of you that really wants to be more social, wants to engage, wants to be around people. And then you have another part that's anxious about being social. It could even be more than two, right? It could be and a part that then gets angry at the part that gets anxious about being social. Yes. And so then you're just in this internal fight with yourself. And what's cool about IFS is that I think we're often working against these things. And this instead is let's slow down and look at the different parts that are here around this situation that's bothering you or challenging, and see if we can work with each one individually to get them to understand each other from a place of what IFS would call capital S self. So that could be depending on what you're thinking about, your most love place, or you can put it any way you want. But it's this core that can't be damaged. That is the most compassionate, curious, creative version of you.
Yeah, your best self.
Yeah.
Who you are at your core. What I love about IFS is it's essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chel, because you're the expert on this, but I talk a lot about like reparenting ourselves, right? And that's essentially what you guys are doing in that session, is learning all those different parts and learning to respond to yourself in a much more compassionate way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it too. It's like as if you were the parent that you maybe didn't have. Like that self is the parent you didn't have, or maybe the parent you couldn't have at that time.
Yeah.
And so, you can go in and do things like retrieve child parts from the past and bring them back to be with you now. And there's all kinds of ways to bring in parenting that might not have been the best, to kind of redo that in the present.
Yeah. I think it's really, really important when we have these different parts of self, especially because so many of us don't like certain parts of ourselves, like those parts of ourselves that have those behaviors that are like, oh, why do I do that? Right.
Yeah.
And I talk to so many of my clients and they're so negative about themselves. And I really felt like when I did IFS with my therapist, it was a really beautiful experience of like learning how to talk to myself in a much more compassionate way. And instead of either shutting that part down or, shutting it down or like trying to like push it aside, I guess.
Yeah, trying to mask it or change it in some way.
Yeah, it's like accepting it and also trying to find out like what is good about that part of selves, instead of like, because it does damage us. And maybe you can speak more to that about like, how does that affect you when you don't like parts of who you are that come up all the time? Yeah.
I'm thinking about with what you're saying, like, how can we look at a part and find out what its good intentions were? Because it likely had really, really good intentions. And so if we can look at it from that angle instead, to see how it was trying to protect or survive, that it was trying desperately to do something good for you to keep you safe, probably.
Yeah.
That's maybe another way to look at that. And then I would just also say, if I was sitting with you and you told me you didn't like certain parts of yourself, I'd probably say like, well, that's a part that doesn't like a part, because yourself, Jamie, who's not a part, would never say that about those parts.
Yeah, that's true. And that is like, so when I was talking about those two parts that I was saying, my people pleaser self and my, F the world, Jamie, teenage self. Those are the parts of me that tend to battle the most, right? They get really frustrated with each other. Usually if I am in, an escalated state or like arguing with myself, essentially, it's usually those two parts. It's the part of me that's the empath that's like, I want to help the world and we need to help everyone. And then the part of me that's like, you cannot be ruinously empathic and sacrifice yourself, and gets mad at myself for doing these things that I know are not good for my own, self.
Yeah.
And how in a session would you go about, helping that person to find a new role, maybe, and maybe we should probably, because that's therapy talk, guys. I apologize.
Find something they like to do more, or that feels better, or
so when we're talking about roles and parts, what does that mean, Chel?
Yeah, I mean, that is like, possibly you have a part, Jamie, whose job it is, right, to be really empathic and please everybody, because that we don't know what it does, but it does something for you to keep you safe. So just finding out why certain parts have certain jobs, and then seeing if if that part was able to release that job because some other things were healed up, what job would that part like to do more? Like, how could you use the strengths of that part to do something that feels more aligned with how you see yourself in your quote unquote, like best self. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's like one of the things my therapist did with me, right? Because that hostile part of self is the part of self that I tend to suppress the most. And I think that's probably for a lot of us, because that's the part of self that's usually not socially acceptable by society, right?
Right. So,
Go ahead. One of the things my therapist did with me is she's like, well, that part of you, just like her role is to set the boundary because you stink at boundaries. And most of my life I did. I sucked at boundaries. But it was how that part set the boundary, right? It was the level of aggression and like absolute cutoff, no wiggle room. The way I set that boundary was really hard and cold.
Yeah.
Whereas like working with myself to maybe like pay attention to when that part of self is coming up more and I'm starting to feel like my boundaries are violated so that I can have that part join with the empathic part of me that you were talking about to be like, hey, let's have a conversation about how this is making me feel and set appropriate boundaries so that I don't feel like I have to scream and fly off the handle like a lunatic.
Right. Yeah. And what you're saying too, it's like one way to think about it is like, imagine your hand is on your face. Just holding your face. You can't see your hand if your hand's on your face. But if you just move your hand back away from your face like an inch, you can be in relationship with your hand. And so what you're talking about is like that part of you was flooding you and taking over, so you couldn't be in relationship with it. But when you're able to notice it, even in the noticing, there's some space from it. And that's a different way of being with that part than being the part, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's really about like that learning that part of self and not suppressing it so that it doesn't just rear its ugly head up when stuff gets really bad and that fight or flight response comes out that makes that part be like, no, I need to act now.
Yeah.
Because you start to notice those warning signs and that body stuff that most of us tend to really ignore.
Yeah.
So when we get back from break, guys, we're going to share some more examples and talk about who this therapy would be great for. Stick around. You've been listening to Good Enough with Jamie Vollmoeller from Long Island EMDR.
Thank you for listening to Good Enough with a Trauma Therapist. This is your host, Jamie Vollmoeller. If you live in the states of New York or Missouri, we'd love to work with you. New Yorkers, give us a call at Long Island EMDR at 631-503-1539 or visit our website at liemdr.com. And for those of you living in Missouri, please call Brave Counseling and Psychiatry at 573-825-6441. Visit brave-mo.com.
Welcome back to Good Enough. I am your host, Jamie Vollmoeller, and I am here with the lovely Chelsea Mojalali.
She did it right again.
I did it right again. Yay. Okay. So we've been talking about parts of self and like learning who you are as a whole person, right? How has it been helpful to your clients? Like, what is some of the changes you see in their behavior when they really start to know and accept like all parts of who they are?
Yeah, I think just the first thing, which is something I've noticed just within like the first session of meeting someone, that just talking about parts in this way and saying like, that part's welcome to be here and we're going to get to know it, as opposed to trying to figure out ways to maybe put some coping skills over it or fix it in some way, that even that little shift, I can see it land for people and like be an opening for some hope. So I noticed that. But then practically, I think what I've noticed most too is like just being able to separate, like I was just talking about before with my hand, like being able to notice I'm not anxious. A part of me is anxious. It's not who I am. I am not anxiety.
Yeah.
And having a little more compassion for when those parts do flood you, because if you've already done a little work with them, you have more understanding after whatever event or behavior happens. Like, I know that happened from a place of pure good intention. It wasn't intended to hurt.
Yeah.
So with having some more maybe grace or gentleness with yourself, if those things are still happening, those are like two small shifts I've noticed for sure, which I guess aren't that small.
No. Yeah. So you say small shifts, but like, I mean, I remember I think parts work was probably one of the best parts of therapy that I've ever done, because it was like, oh, okay, I don't have to like suppress this version of me. Mm-hmm. And it really shifted the way I thought about myself and my past, because it was like, I used to think like, oh, I was just a bad kid and this behavior was just bad. And, you know, like learning about the why, like, why was she doing that? Why was young Jamie doing these things? Why did she feel like that was the only way to survive? Really helped me to have a lot more compassion for myself and not get frustrated when that inner voice, that part would come up, because I would always dismiss it because I'm like, I don't like that.
Right.
I don't like that. I don't want to feel that way again. And having that compassion really helped me to just feel more comfortable with like every part of myself, and know that like even in times in my life where I didn't necessarily agree with my behavior, or if my clients did that behavior, you know, I work with them on those behaviors because they're not the best. It's like understanding that, you know, we're doing the best with the information, the resources that we have at the time, and that no matter what, like if you have severely distinct parts, right? For our listeners, that usually means you've experienced a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
So, you know, multiple parts, or like parts that take over the whole quite often, is really highly correlated, guys, with dissociation, which I've talked to you guys a lot about before. And IFS really helps you to not dissociate so much. It helps you to really be present and in your body, because I feel like so many of us that are highly dissociative just kind of move through life and we're not present. We're not in our bodies because we've never felt safe.
Yeah.
Even with ourselves, we don't feel safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just being able to, again, notice is in itself gonna put a immediate like break to not being present. So if you're practicing noticing the parts, there's no way that you are the part if you're looking at it or noticing it, however you want to think about that or frame that. But
no, that's super, super helpful. So Chelsea, what are some clients, like what are some, for our listeners, like who do you feel is like a really great candidate for IFS?
Everybody.
Everybody.
I'm biased, but no, I mean, I think, definitely anyone who's experienced any kind of trauma, and that doesn't have to be like
big
really
T
obvious big T trauma. Yeah. So because we've all got stuff. So if you notice in your life, I did something and I don't know why I do this thing over and over and over, which I feel like is a really universal feeling.
Yeah. Those patterns that we keep talking about. Yeah.
That person, a person who like in relationship notices cyclical issues with their partner. Like we always get in conflict over, I don't know, me doing everything. But I can't stop doing everything.
And then I get resentful that I'm doing everything.
Resentful that I'm doing everything. Not talking about me, talking about all of us, right? Yeah. But stuff like that. I mean, so it really is everybody. But if you have trauma, there's likely a lot of protection you have up. And so if you've gone to other kinds of therapy, maybe that's gotten in the way or blocked you from making progress that felt sufficient to you. And so this IFS can help to work with those parts that are super protective, like even a part that dissociates you completely. We can start there because you won't be able to get past that part without learning why it does what it does and what it's afraid is going to happen if it stops doing that job.
Yeah. And that's a really big thing. And I think that was really helpful to me when my therapist walked me through that. Like, what is she afraid is going to happen if she doesn't set that hard boundary? Like, what will happen?
Yeah.
And I love that it's another form of, bottom up approach instead of top down. Because when you were talking before about those coping skills, I think the clients that wind up at our practice have been to a lot of therapists that do talk therapy and maybe cognitive behavioral therapy, but it feels more like, and guys, I've said this a million times, cutting the grass instead of ripping it out from the roots, because we're not integrating, we're not understanding our whole selves. We're not, finding out how to make the whole system, like our whole self work. We're just trying to slap a Band-Aid on. And it also really makes those parts of ourselves, like the hostile that I was talking about, feel like even more rejected, which should actually make that come out more.
For sure.
Because you're like, that part of you will get upset that it's
of course,
you're
like a kid.
Yeah, like a kid.
But then, so there's nothing wrong with coping skills, like especially if somebody is needs, some quick things to feel safe or whatever. But like eventually, this is going to help find out why and help to solve from the root of the problem or challenge, however you want to put that.
Yeah. And I think for most, and we work with our practice with a lot of women. We see a lot of women, a lot of burnt out mamas. It's pretty much most of the women in our practice are burnt out mamas over here, guys. So we see a lot of those. But one of the biggest things that our clients always say is what they want to work on is liking themselves and feeling comfortable with themselves and feeling confident in themselves. And where we're not integrated, when we don't accept every part of us and really like sit with our feelings and allow ourselves to have space and time to really understand ourselves, know what our needs are, know what our wants are, and feel confident in verbalizing that, it can be really hard to make lasting change and progress and to feel calm every day and feel good in your body and enjoy your life. So guys, if you have enjoyed this conversation, if you feel like you could be a candidate for internal family systems, Chelsea is also trained in EMDR as well.
And they work really well together, actually. We don't have time to get into that.
They're so amazing together. And IFS, guys, is a really hard training to get into. So like Chelsea's a unicorn right now because there's very few people who actually have taken the true training.
Thank you for listening to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist. We appreciate you listening. While our host may provide some personal and professional advice, we want to remind you that this show is for entertainment purposes only. Each individual situation is unique, and Good Enough is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you need a therapist and are located in New York or Missouri, feel free to reach out to us at liendr.com or brave-mo.com.
And I want to remind you guys that you are good enough.